Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about 32 Yolks, From My Mother's Table to Working the Line by Eric Ripert. That is Chef Eric Ripert. And if you're familiar, this is very much in the line of chef memoirs. I've read ones by Anthony Bourdain, Gordon Ramsay, Marcus Samuelsson, David Chang. Fortunately, the one by David Chang, Eat a Peach, made me realize I really don't like David Chang and I don't want to support his work for numerous reasons. That's a different discussion. But that's the danger of reading chef memoirs is you can find out because they're willing to be vulnerable and share with you their origin story that sometimes I've come to realize great art and really wonderful food is art in expression can come from great trauma. And the first time I think I I came up against this argument was when I started to learn some things about Hitchcock. One of the projects I did in Paris over a number of years was watching every single Hitchcock film ever with a group of people. We would eat, we would watch the film, we'd talk about it afterwards. And over this period of time, I was studying more, learning more about Hitchcock. And there was definitely a darker side to him. And some of his finest films came up against stories of how he would treat his female stars. So then the question necessarily comes back, not just from Hitchcock, but from a book like this one, is is it to be expected that sometimes things that you appreciate, be they art, music, food, are they the products of really dark and unfortunate things that have happened to people? And that's something that you have to deal with yourself. In this particular case, Repair talks about the trauma he went through. In particular, I would say the divorce of his parents when he was around 6 or 7 is foundational in who Repair is. It goes from the beginning of the book all the way to the end, and I suspect it still to this day affects him. Compounded with that was the death of his father. Not when he was very young, but still when he was younger. And to not just have a divorce happen, but then to lose his father as well. So the father is somewhat frozen in time, but his mother receives the punishment, the blame for things. It's difficult, and this is one of those arguments that you'll hear in our era in which divorce is something as common as marriage, that people say, well, either you stay together for the kids, or I don't want to teach my kids about a dysfunctional marriage. Repair's book is a perfect counter argument to that idea, that if you have a divorce that's actually in all likelihood far more traumatic to a child, something that stays with that child forever, in a way that a difficult marriage doesn't, because then that child grows up and says, yeah, marriage is hard, but you can stick through it. Now, again, before the all police show up in the comment section, I am not saying that there aren't reasons sometimes that you may need to live separately from your spouse. But there are consequences to treating marriage as if it's just a contract that can be broken at any time. There are major consequences for society, not just in the religious order, but in the natural order as well. That's a different discussion. But I just want to share some of the trauma that here he is years and years, we're talking decades later. And as he's writing this memoir, here's what he shares with us. Perhaps if they hadn't been so happy to begin with, the end would have been less heartbreaking. But it was like a part of each of us died in that apartment the day my mother and I moved out. My father, who was an expert at putting on a sunny appearance, did the best job of seeming unchanged. But in the years that followed my parents' divorce, I would come to see his loss, his grief. For my mother and I, the pain was more immediate and easier to see. My mother, who was so beautiful, became like a model who has smiled so many times her smile is frozen, patently fake. Even when she seemed to be in a good mood, she showed a studied grin that did not match the faraway look in her eyes. As for me, I went from being a happy kid to a kind of pint-sized depressive. From the time I was 5 until I went away to cooking school, and for many years after, I was rarely truly happy, just different degrees of sad. And this was because parents said to themselves, it's better for us to be happy, quote unquote, apart, instead of staying together for the children. And people don't realize that idea of staying together for the children is a very good argument, because marriage is not about you anymore. It's about a commitment that you've made to another person. So you've already included another person in your life. And then when you bring children into the world, it's a commitment you made to those people as well. And you cannot withdraw from a lifelong commitment without there being serious consequences, such that even someone as brilliant and as tortured in a way as Ripert is being willing to share this with us. And I think it has to be instructive. I think he's sharing his pain with us to help people understand how destructive divorce really can be. Besides spoiling me at the table, my mother also indulged my appetite at the supermarket. I'd tell her exactly which jambon de Paris and yogurt I wanted from the shelves. I was extremely picky about my favorite variety of Petit Suisse cheese, not to mention the brand of mini toast that I had for breakfast, along with the butter and jam. She usually rushed me past the cookie aisle, but I didn't mind. There was always something better to eat at home. For me, watching her make pastry was pure magic. And then, of course, there was the pastry itself. But once the dishes had been washed and the tarte-tatin put away for tomorrow's snack, my anger at my mother and my hunger for my father returned. And I just put in the notes, wow. To be so young and to be conscious of the resentments that you held against your parents for making this choice. The idea that children don't understand. Children understand. And there is a deep anger within them. And if you look at many of the school shooters in America, many of them are the products of divorce. So yeah, staying together for the kids is not a simplistic argument. It's one with deep, sensible roots and something that people should consider more, especially if you make a lifelong commitment to somebody, that's something you have to consider. So after this major trauma, he also has the trauma of boarding school, which I and my siblings, we all went to boarding school. We all actually really loved it for different reasons. But we're also all the first person to tell anyone when we're talking about it that we know it's not for everyone. Boarding school is definitely a school of hard knocks. It's one in which you're going to be forced to grow up quickly. And it can lead to a major change in the relationship with your parents, the most significant of which you grow up much more quickly. You do your own laundry when you're 14. You have to take care of your homework without anyone breathing over your shoulder. You have to get to bed at a time that makes sense for you. No one's watching what time you're going to bed. So that means you develop an independence that your parents will recognize and realize, oh no, my kids don't need me as much. And this is something my mother particularly would tell us in later years, like, oh, you all grew up too quickly. And we said, Mom, you're the one who advocated for us going to boarding school. But she regretted it, but we don't regret it in that way. But it was a trauma for him. Also, he relates a story of a near miss sexual abuse situation, which again, another chance of trauma, which those traumatic experiences are also counterbalanced with a lot of opportunity and privilege. And this is somewhat going towards the point I'd like to make, which is what determines what it is that we do in this life. So Ripert ends up being this world famous chef with Michelin stars in New York City. And one may say, well, that's obvious. He grew up in France, and France is this great culinary nation, and he worked for Joel Robuchon. Yes, obviously. But how did he get there? So it's not just the quality of being French. Being French means that you grew up with this great culinary heritage. But you'd be surprised how many French people are really not in touch with that. This is a thing that when I first moved to France, in my mind, I thought, well, all French people know everything about wine and everything about cheese. And as the curious foreigner who was adapting to life in France, I was always asking questions about everything about wine and cheese. And so then I would start talking about some things sometimes. And I realized I would know more about a particular region or about a particular variety of cheese, not because I was any smarter than that French person, but I was just more curious. They had grown up with it, so they had taken it for granted. Ripert is an example of someone who grew up with the French food culture, but he didn't take it for granted. He was always curious, and this was fed by people like his mother. His mother was a gourmet cook. She would spend money going to really fine restaurants, Michelin-starred restaurants. So he's eating at these very fine restaurants at the ages of 7, 8, 9, 10. So he's developing this palate. He's thinking about things. He's seeing techniques. He has a very fine palate. Then he's assisted by family members who cook really well and give him different exposures to different styles of cooking. Then there's a chef in the town where he and his mother live and takes him under his wing a little bit, shows him things after school, and he soaks it up like a sponge. And then the story that gets us to Le Bernardin in New York, the bridge story, is the latter half of this book, is working for Joel Robuchon in Paris, and the sort of torturous perfection that inside every great chef. And as I said before, the ones I named at the beginning of this review, Marcus Samuelson, Anthony Bourdain, Gordon Ramsay, there is a neuroticism about perfection. They want what is expressed on the plate to be the very best, and it doesn't matter how many times it has to be redone, it's going to be perfect. Part of that is learned by people like Robuchon, who I would say are unreasonable. But there is a very famous quote that all of history depends on the unreasonable man. And in a certain sense, progress in art depends on you willing to be unreasonable with yourself. So, and Ripert would even argue it's okay for you to even be unreasonable with other people. No one is going to push back and say, well, you that's wrong to be unreasonable to yourself. That's a choice that you make for yourself. You're willing to push yourself. No one else is quote unquote harmed by that. Ripert is willing to say, and I think those other chefs that I named would be willing to say, it's even okay for people to traumatize you in service of a greater good. They all say in the memoirs in different ways, well, back then in the kitchen, people would yell at you, hit you, punch you, kick you. And he said, we don't do things like that anymore. And I always laugh and say, yeah, you don't do things like that anymore because you get sued. But they said that was just how things were back then. But they don't regret any of it. You always hear them saying they're so grateful for it. And what that means is people are willing to sign up for the trauma in service of a greater good. And that's like anything in life in which you're willing to do something very difficult, which will, quote unquote, trauma, will leave that for you, but you use that trauma to develop to something, to sublimate it into something better, to something good, and potentially sublimate it into great art. That means you have to be willing to take on that difficulty, those challenges, that emotional battering, and which sometimes may lead to trauma. But the point is, it's your choice. No one forced Ripert to do this. They all volunteered, and at any point he could have walked out, and even he could walk out at one point. You see him come back at one point in the story. This is all to say, it's not a long book. It's it's 250 pages. Really interesting insight if you're interested in France, if you're interested in French cuisine, if you're interested in choosing your path in life, if you're interested in hearing what people have to say who actually dealt with divorce in their own lives. All of these are good reasons to read 32 Yolks by Eric Ripert. So if you'd like to buy a copy, there's a link in the description. That's one of the ways you can support this channel. You can also buy me a coffee or send me a PayPal. There's links for that in the description. If you want to support my work on an ongoing basis, you can subscribe by becoming a YouTube member or my Patreon. You get early access to reviews like this one, as well as have a chance to talk with me privately and ask me questions on private live streams. And if you'd like to potentially nominate a book for me to review in 2025, you'll find a link to my Amazon wishlist below. Just pick a book from there, send it to me, and I will review it. That's another way you can support my work. As always, until next time, enjoy your reading.